Assume the power of the highest seat in all the land, of knowing your attacker wields a global coalition born of three-letter agencies who'll make a life's mission seat in all the land, discredit you through knowing your attacker wields collusion. Big tech is never gonna separate from our surveillance state. Fuck's sakes, they're just a breath away from total fusion. So there will come a time where even if you see the light, your voice will never reach the sky through all the bots and all the noise pollution. So trust us when we tell you that the masking of abuses is perhaps this country's oldest institution. And I know nothing nobler than facing it in honor of the truth when you know that the people holding power have been neutralizing truth since there was wet ink on the Constitution. So know that Tara's truth is something crucial to the movement. And if you see yourself a partner to the revolution, help this country see through all the baseless propaganda through the crux of Joe's illusions. And recognize that Tara Reade gave everything she had so she could tell us what the truth is. Recognize the decent thing to do when someone bares their soul and shows their bruises is not to ask for context or offer up your own solutions. Your job is just to listen with an honest mind and put yourself on Tara's side a moment so you understand the path she chooses. That there is no instant fame worth the dragging of your name. And if that's what you think, you've a lot to learn about the kind of facts the mob can handle and the kind that it refuses. You've a lot to learn about the news and all its many uses. Guess you've yet to learn the truth the news will serve as fruit from which they've squeezed out all the juices. And we all eat the husk and just pretend it's full of nutrients and isn't really useless. But the jaws of our ability to yield accountability are absolutely toothless.
Everyone, I'm your host, Tara Reade, and this is the Politics of Survival. Many of you have been, my phone's been kind of blowing up, so I'll cut right to the chase. I did a Tucker Carlson interview a couple of months ago about what happened to me when I was a staffer for Joe Biden, and that has been released. So the full interview is released tomorrow. There are clips tonight. You can find it on INN if you look on our Twitter feed, and I will eventually do a quote tweet and throw up some pictures. Tucker was very lovely. He gave me a platform with dignity and grace, and I appreciated that so much. So check out my interview with Tucker Carlson, and my hope is there will be an investigation into Joe Biden's corruption, not only for the sexual assault that I endured and being basically him using his power to silence me and go after me and my family, but also with issues around Ukraine and the economic which I believe, in my opinion, has been corruption and this proxy war that the US and NATO is fighting against Ukraine, and the horrible Russophobia that has happened and kind of put a stranglehold on our country to the point where really good news outlets like RT have been utterly canceled in the US and actually banned in Europe. So many of my audience members are RT fans, so I know you understand how awful that is. And tonight I have some special guests. They're going to talk to me about another story that's being very much hushed up and very much silenced. And that is about the fact that the US and NATO combined have almost spent $80 billion on weapons and aid going to Ukraine. There has been very little oversight or accounting for those weapons. As a result, Interpol a couple of months ago released a warning that many of those weapons are ending up in the hands of terrorists. And here tonight to discuss this is the UN ambassador, and I'm very honored to have him back from Russia, Dmitry Polyanskiy, and the esteemed professor, Dan Kovalik, an author who is also here to discuss this, who just recently spoke to the UN about this issue. So welcome, both of you. I'm so glad to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tara.
Yeah, so let's start. First of all, I was gonna maybe take a shot at talking to the UN Security Council because I've done a lot of research into this issue, and I've done a lot of, I have a law degree. I've studied international relations and worked for politicians. And so I was very interested in that there's a lack of accounting, and Republicans are the only ones that seem to be trying to push for some sort of oversight or accounting for all these weapons going to Ukraine, and they're ending up in the hands of possibly terrorists. And I was wondering, Dmitry, when I tried to come to that meeting, we had something happen, and Reif, you can put up what happened. The video link was accepted, I was vetted, and then it was revoked. So I guess Biden's team or the Westerners got a hold of that. But Dmitry, could you talk about the resistance, not just to me speaking, because Dan spoke eloquently in my place, but just having the meeting at all? Can you talk about that?
Yes, Tara, that was not an easy task to conduct this meeting. We asked for it, and this is a topic that is very awkward for our Western ex-partners. That's why, of course, we feel a lot of resistance, and I think you got a share of this resistance as well, because I think your name was too toxic for them, and they did everything they could to block you from participating, and they have such a right. I don't think that the Biden administration was involved, but I would say the US mission, of course, was part of it, and other Western missions. They objected. They said that you don't have necessary expertise for this. And it's very good that we had Dan to replace you, and it was very difficult for them to block two moves because the image would be, of course, very much spoiled. So we managed to have Dan speaking, and I'm very much grateful to him, because he presented us with a very blunt picture of what's happening about arms deliveries to Ukraine. And we think that this is a very important element of this conflict. And in fact, you were absolutely right that the hostilities that are now taking place there is not between Russia and Ukraine as such. Sometimes it's very difficult, and we mentioned it in our speech, to understand whom are we fighting, because we are fighting Western weapons, which are being tackled with Western instructors. There are a lot of Western mercenaries, and we know this because we hear them on the radio and we have their bodies discovered. We also know that the troops there are being guided, the Ukrainian troops are being guided by Western intelligence data. So if you combine these three elements, it's really hard to understand whom you are fighting and what kind of Ukrainians are we facing. Are they Ukrainians at all? And of course, another angle of this story you rightfully mentioned is that the arms, because of corruption and because of corruption both in Ukraine and I think in the West, easily gets in the hands of those who do not deserve any right to have these weapons, to terrorists. And Dan mentioned Nigerian President Buhari saying that this was one of the main sources now of deliveries of weapons in the Sahel region, which is already a trend. So we see that it's not only a problem there between Ukraine and Russia, but it's now becoming the global problem of smuggling of arms from Ukraine, which is a black box, and this black box is absolutely open. And as we witnessed during the meeting, and I think that Dan will share my impression, that Western countries absolutely don't want to speak about it. They just dismiss it. They say there is not such a problem. My American counterpart even assumed that the only smuggling of the weapons which is happening is when Russian troops capture some of this weapon, and then it's getting to the black market. This is of course laughable and ridiculous, but that was the only thing that he was ready to admit about smuggling of weapons. So of course this was a very illustrative meeting, and the trends were absolutely visible, that they want to speak about everything. They want to repeat the same mantra about Russian aggression and so on and so forth, but they don't want to look into the root causes of this conflict, and they don't want to acknowledge that the factor of deliveries of the weapons, of Western weapons to Ukraine, is actually putting gasoline into fire. And I think yeah, that's absolutely obvious for everybody.
Now I have a question. You saw that Sam Bankman-Fried was just arrested today and in the Bahamas, and he was coincidentally supposed to testify before Congress tomorrow. And so he won't be doing that. He's in custody in jail in the Bahamas. And this has kind of raised some suspicion. But the reason I bring it up is cryptocurrency is a way for arms dealers or people dealing with drugs or human trafficking to use the currency without being traced sometimes, bad actors, right? There are plenty of people who use it for good and for charities, but there's also that element. Now, Ukraine received huge amounts of crypto, FTX donations.
Mhm.
Do you have any thoughts about that perhaps ending up in the black market or being used to purchase or sell weapons online in Ukraine?
We raised this issue repeatedly. It is, of course, linked to corruption in Ukraine, the widespread corruption. And this all looks very suspicious, but we didn't concentrate on it. It was kind of a bypass topic in our discussions. Maybe we will come to this topic more in detail in the future, but we're now just following what's happening around this case as well.
As far as, and this kind of brings me to another question. As far as the meeting that you had, did you feel that your message was getting through, or did you just feel a defensive pushback and still just kind of, almost just gaslighting, just, the Western countries just pretending it doesn't exist? Or do you think that this discussion you just had last Friday, will prompt some more meetings and perhaps some push in Great Britain and in America for more oversight of these large weapons?
Well, everything that is being said in the council is being documented, and it doesn't go down in the sand. So I think that there was a big audience, much larger than Security Council members themselves. If you mean Western members, well, I wouldn't say that it was to any avail, because it's all falling on the deaf ears. But there is a bigger audience in the UN, and there are a lot of member states of the UN who are asking questions and who are following this issue very closely, and who are trying to figure out what's happening and to what extent is this problem affecting the prospects of peaceful solution of this conflict. And I think that was very important for them. But as for the fallout, for the results of the meeting, I think that's the usual thing, because the Western countries are not interested in spreading this information. So all the mainstream media correspondents were silent about it. The only coverage that I saw was in Russian press and in some Serbian, I think, press. So the countries that don't have this kind of modern censorship, I would say, which is more important than the previous type of censorship. So I can answer your question in this way.
You've been watching the Twitter files unload as Elon Musk has taken over Twitter for $44 billion. And what's resulted is he's been able to illuminate some light on the collusion between the Biden campaign, the Biden now administration, the DNC, which is the Democratic National Committee, with social media and media to suppress certain stories, the Hunter Biden laptop, probably mine. Also to spread Russophobia and to push this idea that Russia interfered with the election. And then now things like this, like when we're talking about weapons getting into the hands of terrorists, to suppress those stories. Have you felt a shift? In other words, do you feel more people are asking you questions or noticing your account or seeing you more, hearing you more, since the Twitter files are starting to kind of come forward?
I have an impression that I'm kind of shadow banned on Twitter, because, well, from time to time, there are like breakthroughs, and there are a lot of followers and a lot of people getting through me. Now I feel I'm kind of isolated, and very few people really make comments. Not mentioning the bots, of course, the Ukrainian bots, which are going crazy when I publish anything. So yes. I really have very strange feeling about Twitter, and I would really be very curious to learn my current status in Twitter, and not only myself, but some of my colleagues also have questions in this regard. So hopefully they will be clarified. As for the situation that you mentioned, all this alleged collusion, well, this is of course very laughable case. It was laughable from the outset. It was absolutely clear that it was all set up and there was no substance in all these allegations. I think now everybody understands this. But what is really worth mentioning is that nobody has even has ever said we're sorry for kind of trying to put black paint on you guys. It's like, you know, finding weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So when Mr. Powell was in Security Council lying about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So has anybody apologized after that? Has anybody said, guys, we're sorry, that was a wrong move? No, they said that, well, there was no weapons of mass destruction, but it was a right cause. So I think something similar is happening maybe now vis-a-vis Russia. So people are admitting that this was all absolutely false cause, but nobody will apologize to us, and they will just keep going as if nothing has happened. And that's really something that I can't understand in US politics.
Well, you know, we're very controlled and propagandized, although no one likes to admit it. It is a thing. And, you know, being someone who's worked in politics and communications, I can tell you that it's become more and more obvious, as you may have experienced. So the Russophobia has resulted with not allowing for room for a lot of diplomacy. There doesn't seem to be any discussion about it. There's mostly discussion about more and more weapons and less oversight. And I think, you know, that's why we're having this discussion tonight, Dmitry. Could you talk a little bit about your job right now going forward and the mood right now in Moscow, or, you know, something that you would like American citizens to know, because American citizens are not, of course, the political elite running this. Most American citizens don't want this conflict, right? And most American citizens don't have feelings of animosity towards Russia even. And there's been polls to indicate that. In fact, Vladimir Putin, your president, of the Russian Federation, had actually very high polling in the US when they did polling. So to some extent, some of the propaganda has not worked. So what is the mood right now as we move forward and deeper into winter and towards spring? Is there any movement towards peace, more allowing you to do more diplomacy?
I think, Tara, that most of the US citizens which would happen to be in Moscow, they will be very much surprised of how different the country and the life in the capital will be different from what mass media and state propaganda will tell you. And it's really always a start of conversation with any American fellow man, I would say, fellow citizens, for asking me questions. And when I answer them and when I give them facts, they're very much astonished about the economic situation in Russia, about the level of support that our authorities have in Russia, and the level of patriotism that we have. So this kind of military operation that we are now conducting is not something that we want to choose this. And we had different scenario, of course, for all this. But it was there was no other solution, unfortunately, to get rid of this hornet's nest that was on our borders, which sooner or later would really become a much bigger problem for Russia. And this hornet's nest, of course, didn't turned up by itself. It was planted there by the United States and its allies. It was growing and growing and growing, and now we know, thanks to Mrs. Merkel, who was one of the guarantors of the Minsk agreements, we now know for sure that the West was just winning time, trying to arm Ukraine and preparing for this kind of situation, but with much better starting positions for Ukraine. So now I think the public opinion in Russia, after Mrs. Merkel's words, is even more convinced in the fact that it was the right decision to start this military operation. We would like to have the goals of this military operation achieved through peaceful means, and it was possible. We were proposing to Western countries on the eve of this operation to get around the table and to discuss security guarantees for Russia, and to discuss things about Ukraine, how Ukraine needs to implement Minsk agreements. And it was very easy, by the way, several very easy conditions. First of all, to stop shelling its citizens, to acknowledge the fact that they have human rights, they have the right to to speak their own language, to worship their heroes and not the people who were collaborating with Hitler. And that's it. Basically, these two basic rules, something that is absolutely normal for anybody else, something that is normal for Europe, for United States, but that something is not required from Ukraine by Western countries. So if we could achieve it through other means, if we could achieve it through negotiating table, through some kind of guarantees, we would with pleasure do it. But unfortunately, what we got from the West at this moment was very condescending treatment and kind of dismissal of any our preoccupations. And then, as you know, the shelling of Donbass intensified, very significantly intensified. And that's it all started. So how can we end it? Again, our president stated repeatedly that we would be pleased to end it peacefully. We would be pleased to end it at negotiating table. But of course, it is possible only through looking into the deep roots, grassroots of this problem and eradicating them. For Ukraine not representing in the future any danger to Russia, for Ukraine treating Russian-speaking population in the way it should be treated. Now what we see is quite the opposite. To all the problems that I mentioned, you can also add the religious persecution that you have now in Ukraine, fighting with the church, with the churches, the Orthodox Church there, which is also very deplorable. So the country is absolutely going in the wrong direction, and nobody in the West is really noticing it. So I'm afraid that the only thing that we have to continue our military operation, and we have to fight not only with Ukraine, as I told you, but with NATO weapons, with more and more involvement from NATO intelligence data and mercenaries. We have to fight all these factors, but we have no other way. We have no other choice, I'm afraid, to use all the military tools that are in our possession, and that's what we have right now.
Well, and you brought up some good points. I mean, and to the audience that is newer and wasn't with us when Dmitry was in last time, he was talking also about the beginning of this conflict being in 2014, which is when the coup happened, and Julian Assange, who's now been imprisoned for publishing emails and phone calls and proof that there were war crimes being committed in a coup in 2014 by the US government and British intelligence. And you know, there's proof of that. It's been undisputed. And then since 2014, there was the Minsk II agreements that were not upheld. And that's what you're referring to, with no intention from the West to uphold them, apparently, is what's come out by the former German chancellor. And 14,000 Russian nationals lost their lives over the period of last 8 years, plus now more since the bombing of Donbass. And it's heartbreaking, really, that the whole fact about Nazis, the Azov battalions and other battalions are quite active and have been armed by the US and by NATO countries to do more harm and to commit war crimes possibly. And also, well, in fact, they have. So, and there's also been false flags where Russia's been blamed for Bucha, and there's proof that it was it was a false flag by one of those battalions actually that carried out some of those missions. So there's lots of information about this war that you can find out the history, and you can find out what's been going on. If you look at like Ukraine on Fire, which is by Igor Lopotonik, who is Ukrainian and Russian director who works with Oliver Stone. So I suggest that you do that. Look at Max Blumenthal's most recent Gray Zone, and you can get, some historical context. Reif, do we have any questions for Dmitry before we move on? And we're going to talk to Dan and Dmitry.
For diplomatic solutions and the legitimate concerns and desires for security, 4 years. Just kind of agreeing with you, I think. So.
Yeah, and I think a lot of American citizens have really been seeing the light more and more about what's been going on here. And I think there's also a fatigue in the United States and in European countries that our economies are actually tanking. While we're imposing all these sanctions on Russia, it's actually having a different effect on Europe. They're having economic problems due to these sanctions. And in America, instead of spending money on infrastructure and the people and the workers, money is going to weapons and aid in Ukraine, and it's creating a lot of division in the US. Now, one thing that happened, I wanted to bring to your attention to, a US congressman, when it was brought up, he's from California and a Democrat, it was brought up, he's on the oversight committee, and they brought up the weapons ending up in the hands of terrorists in Ukraine. And they said, we need some accounting, and he threw back, this is just Russian disinformation. So I'm going to bring in Dan Kovalik, who's a professor at the International Human Rights Law School and University of Pittsburgh, and an author. He also spoke at the UN about this issue. Dan, thank you. And would you kind of elaborate on what I just laid out there for that attitude that came from the US Congress, particularly the Democratic wing?
Yeah, I mean, these allegations are not coming, from Russia. They're coming from mainstream US sources, and so the presentation that I gave, which you helped me with, Tara, was based on things like CBS News, which did a documentary on this. As you said, the head of Interpol warned that these weapons would end up in the hands of terrorists. As late as November 1 of this year, so about 6 weeks ago, the Washington Post reported that the US government had only inspected about 10% of all the weapons we had sent to Ukraine, that we only had a handle on where 10% of the weapons have gone. Other sources like CNN also did a story, I believe back in April, saying that, look, we don't have a handle on where these weapons are going. It's impossible for us to have a handle on it, especially because Ukraine has been a place where arms have been easily trafficked within and through since the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's a very corrupt country. It's the most corrupt country in Europe. And again, back in April, they were predicting that this would be a big problem. And they quoted various US officials saying, look, we have no way to get on top of this. And again, many months go on. November, we're into November, and already they admit we've only looked at about 10% of where these weapons.
And they have talked about the Nazi problem in Ukraine. And the BBC knows about it because they were airbrushing the insignia off the photos before releasing them in articles. So this is not like the West doesn't know. In fact, there were articles, right, Dan, and you and I have talked about this just recently, before they decided Ukraine is just, full of angels and there's no Nazis, right? But a few years before, there were many articles in mainstream media talking about the problem of nationalists and Nazis, carrying out atrocities in Donbass, correct?
Well, yes. And in fact, let me tell you something. Here's some evidence that people forget about. A number of years ago, Congressman John Conyers from Detroit, he's not a congressman there anymore. He hasn't been for a few years. So this was quite a while ago. Actually sponsored a bill in Congress that got passed and signed by Obama, outlawing or saying it was illegal for the U.S. to arm Nazis in Ukraine. Well, why did he feel a need to do that if there's no Nazis and the U.S. wasn't arming them? Even worse, shortly after that, Congress had a change of heart and repealed that bill. Okay, so they went out of their way, and Obama signed the repeal saying, oh, no, it's okay if the U.S. arms Nazis in Ukraine. So again, why these two bills that are passed if there's no Nazis, right? And as you say, if you look at articles, if you can find them, by the way, they're harder to find on Google because of their algorithm. They suppress these articles. But between 2014 and the beginning of the special operations, you could find a number of articles, a number of human rights organization reports talking about Nazis, neo-Nazis in Ukraine. And you had there's a great quote from the very well-respected former president of Uruguay, Pepe Mujica, who said you can't even call them neo-Nazis. They're just straight up Nazis, right? That have existed in Ukraine since the 1920s, in which the U.S. has kept alive. since World War II in order to counter at first the Soviet Union. And then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US kept supporting them to try to undermine Russia. Again, all this is a matter of fact. It's a matter of history, and yet now it's being denied. I mean, the other thing which has to be pointed out, and this is all part and parcel of this, is the rewriting of history. Who won World War II, right? Well, first of all, you had people like President Reagan who went to Germany and visited a war cemetery, which had a bunch of Nazis buried there. And he suggested that we were always on the same side as Germany, right? And so you had this historical rewriting of history, and a big part of that is denying the role of the Soviet Union in defeating the Nazis, right?
27 million people, yeah.
Yeah, which everyone in the West knew was a fact, but as time has gone on, that's been denied, etc. Why is that important? Because now, they try to claim that, it's Putin that's the fascist, right? And that he's the one imposing fascism, and then the people in Ukraine are fighting fascism. Well, again, it's all part of the historical revision that we're seeing. This is the fault.
Let's talk about the example of fascism, and Dmitry, you had brought this up. Zelensky is talking about banning the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. How is that? How can the US justify and NATO justify that they're holding up some sort of democratic state when he's banned media and he's trying to ban a religion? I mean, Dmitry, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's very appalling to watch, frankly, what's happening. It had some history, and Dan knows it. I think in Poroshenko's time, he's got this kind of Thomas for the so-called Ukrainian Orthodox Church. But in church, you do not decide these things like, by voting or by creating some institutions. This is a matter of creed, of faith. And it has hundreds of years of people's belief. And you can't just do it like in a nutshell. And there is certain structure which might be maybe incomprehensible to some people, but it is quite clear for the believers. And the fact is that they are believing. It's not political structure. And all of a sudden, Poroshenko started this new organization, claiming that it was the correct, the right Orthodox Church for Ukraine, because the current one is affiliated with Russian Patriarchy. But the fact was that before this special military operation, regardless of, despite all the efforts that Ukrainian authority tried to deploy, very tiny fraction of Ukrainians really bought this story, because they stick to their mother church, which was affiliated with Russia, and it has nothing to do with politics at all. It's an absolutely different story. But after the start of our special military operation, when there were extreme repressions and prosecutions of all those who sympathize with Russia, there are cases of people brought to prison and tortured only for having Russian TV or Russian news channels on their mobile phone. So after that, of course, they, at some point of time, they said, okay, let's now try to get a take on this Orthodox Church. And what they are doing now, they are just interrupting the services. They are forcing the priests, instead of praying, to sing the anthem of Ukraine. All these kind of things, and this is terrible. And there is a big resistance from people, but people are intimidated, and people don't want to go in the street. People may be very much confused about this, but what's happening is really terrible. And if you combine it with all these things about Nazism that you were referring to, and and you're absolutely right that Soviet Union and Russia has very special relation towards fascism. We are absolutely intolerant to these kind of things. So for us, it's kind of casus belli. It's kind of a situation which can't be accepted when some country openly promotes Nazi ideology. We genetically feel that this is something that is against us, that is threatening us. So for us, it's very sensitive. So if you combine all these things, if you combine prosecution of Russian language, if you combine the active spread of neo-Nazism and glorification of Nazi collaborators like Bandera and Shukhevich. If you also bring into this picture the prosecution of Russian Orthodox Church, you will understand what kind of feeling our population has towards this conflict. We really have the impression that this is something that we need to solve. And there is a very high degree of patriotism. There is a high degree of mobilization in the whole of Russia. And people are understanding that this issue should be solved, that there shouldn't be any danger coming to our country from Ukraine. And we should also deprive Western countries of their opportunity to meddle into our affairs and to drive wedge with peoples that live in our neighborhood and with whom we want to keep good and friendly and neighborly relations. You know that that about 4.5 million Ukrainians now found refuge in Russia after the beginning of this crisis. So it's absolutely contradicts all these theories about animosity between Russians and Ukrainians, about the fact that we hate each other. This is nonsense, absolute nonsense. Of course, there are brainwashed people, a lot of them during these Maidan years, but most Ukrainians are quite friendly towards Russia, and even more Russians are friendly towards Ukrainians. This is all artificial. This is something that was planted in our neighborhood. It was absolutely not accepted by Russians or by Ukrainians. This is alien to us, and this is also part of the picture, part of this equation that you need to take into consideration.
Very well put. And I have a question for you about, Dan and I were talking about the Nazi issue, and for yourself, because, you know, I had relatives that fought in World War II, and I'm sure you did as well, Dmitry. Could you just talk a little bit about what it's been like, you know, for you at work, like when you're trying to talk to Westerners about the Nazis in Ukraine? What kind of reception are you getting? Are they listening to that at least, or some countries are, or some representatives are and some aren't? What is that like?
Well, for us, still everything that is connected with the Second World War, Great Patriotic War, as we call it, is still an open wound. And you really would find it's very emotional with all the citizens of my country, and we are over emotional to these things. We are very much intolerant to all the glorification of Nazism, all the attempts to kind of rewrite history, and also to distort the history of Second World War, and, as you said, to diminish the role of the Soviet Union. It's not about the role of the Soviet Union. It's about the people who sacrificed their lives for the freedom of the others. So I happened to work in Poland for 3 years as deputy ambassador. And I remember that the whole Poland is kind of a big cemetery. There are a lot of graves, a lot of Soviet graves, a lot of German graves as well, and Polish graves. But Soviet graves are quite numerous. It's about 600,000 people who lost their lives for liberating Poland. And now these people are not being paid any respect by the government of Poland. This is contrary to what people think. And I remember people were much more tolerant at this time. They were kind of tidying up these graves. They were bringing flowers during holidays. So I haven't felt any Russophobia at the level of simple Poles. But at the level of political elite, of course, this was very Russophobic. And again, for us, it's more, maybe we are more sensitive to this. I remember I was on the interview with some guy, some young person from the UK, who was neutral, I would say, and we were discussing these things. And I was telling him it was the situation when there was a Nazi symbol on Zelensky's website, which was displayed, and this Totenkopf symbol, which is normally very sensitive to the UK as well, because some of the British citizens also perished from the hands of this battalion, this Nazi battalion. And when I was telling it to him, I saw absolute indifference in his eyes, and he asked me a question: is it really worth for starting a war? So, you know, it was very hard for me to answer this question for him, because we're kind of from different planets. For me, this is really something which is very serious. If it's something maybe theatrical today, then tomorrow it will lead to another war, for sure. For him, this is just people, weird people. It's, I don't know, maybe for him it's kind of being weird, being queer, I don't know, whatever. So maybe all these kind of things. So, but for me, it's absolutely very, very serious. And for vast majority of my compatriots, even for young people, this is something that we will not tolerate. And then, of course, when they are kind of promoting these things in Ukraine, they are throwing salt into our eyes. This is you need to realize that this is very painful for all of us to realize it. And of course, we will not tolerate this kind of situation at our borders.
Understood. I mean, it is shocking as an American citizen to watch the elite in the governments decide to support and fund, not only support, but fund and arm Nazis in Ukraine that are committing horrible atrocities, and it's been recorded. And then to suppress the journalists, and I want to bring up another thing that I wanted Dan maybe to weigh in on, the website. And I don't know the Ukrainian word. It's the Ukrainian word for a peacekeeper, Mykrovitz or whatever it is.
Mirotvorets. It's Russian as well.
Okay. Mirovitz, yeah. It means peacekeeper, ironically, but it's a kill site. And I've interviewed about 4 people that are on the kill site. I was told recently, I guess I got added to it, so whatever. But it's a kill site where they dox people, they put their photos where they're located, and they even have children, over 300 children. And I had Faina on my show along with Mira Tordara. We talked about her experience in the US and also being on the kill list. Wyatt Reade, an American journalist who was almost killed. His hotel was bombed. He was a minute away. Ava Bartlett as well, and some others. But the US is doing nothing to shut it down, even though the State Department had called it a terrorist website 5 years ago. It's being run, they brag about it being run by Langley, which is Langley, Virginia, for those who may not know in the audience, that's the head of the CIA. So in other words, it's implying that the intelligence community of British and American are in collusion with this kill site. So when Daria Dugina was murdered in Moscow, they put liquidated across her picture, and there's been 12 journalists that have been killed. So Dmitry, first of all, I want to go to you and then to you, Dan. What, if any, reaction has there been from your colleagues about this horrendous kill site that even has children in it?
Well, we repeatedly have been drawing attention to this site and we were writing to Secretary General about this. We were trying to deal with UNICEF on this, and UNICEF was also, which is supposed to be a kind of defender of the rights of the children throughout the globe. UNICEF was very tepid towards this situation. They were trying to ignore it until recently, when we had this pronounced during Security Council meeting directly, and then one of our correspondents addressed direct question to UNICEF. What do they think about 327 minors having personal data displayed at this kill site? And then UNICEF said that, well, we do not approve this kind of thing. We call for Ukrainian government to delete this information about minors. But you're absolutely right. It's not clear who runs this site. At the beginning, it was linked to the Ministry of Interior of Ukraine. Mr. Gerashchenko was kind of a father of this site. Then when they realized that there is a global outcry towards this site, then they changed the affiliation. Now it is being positioned as kind of a neutral site, non-political, but of course everybody understands who runs it. And it can't be done without complicity, without collusion from Western countries and from the United States first and foremost. That's quite clear for everybody. Otherwise, of course, this site would have been blocked already for a long time. But it continues to function. It continues to really threaten people's lives. And Daria Dugina, unfortunately, is not the only person liquidated from this site. There were a lot of others. Especially at the beginning when it was started. And it's not only about threat of assassination, it's also about bullying, and it's about threats. And Faina, that you mentioned, for a 14-year-old girl from Lugansk, also has personal data there, and I can imagine somebody knowing her home address. It's also making her quite an easy target, her and her parents. And
yeah, I mean, someone went to her house.
yeah, a lot of
yeah.
people. And I myself am also on this site, and there are a lot of my colleagues on this site. I'm absolutely sure that Dan, you are also there. You can get assured for this. But when it comes to children, I think this is really far beyond any red line, and any government should really react to this, saying, guys, this is too much, and you need to stop this kind of activity. Well, understand your feelings, but this is criminal. But we don't hear this kind of things from Western countries. We hear some kind of understanding from developing countries, but for them this is something that is quite far away. You know, they are not very much emotionally involved into this, but they are sympathetic with what we are doing in regards of this Miratoris website, which I think is really a shame. And people will always regard this as a shame, the existence of this site and the way they treat minors, especially.
Well, I will continue to raise awareness about it here. And I'm also trying to work with Mira and Faina to raise awareness internationally about this, because it is a form of a war crime to what they're doing. And it's another example of the regime in Kiev just you know, not respecting human life in any way, shape, or form. So Dan, what are your thoughts on that? And also I wanted you to weigh in on, going back to the weapons, on the fact that the DoD kind of threw out a thing that they were going to follow some of the big weapons, but they're not following the smaller ones, which are the problems. So could you weigh in on both those subjects?
Yeah, I guess I'll start with the second question first. I mean, first of all, yeah, I mean, that's what the Department of Defense is saying, that they're going to follow some, as you say, the bigger weapons, not the small weapons. And again, small weapons can do a lot of damage, obviously.
They can kill thousands to hundreds of people. They're talking about the huge, you know, missiles and whatnot, but they're not addressing the smaller, I mean, I shouldn't even say smaller. The other weapons are not mass destruction.
But right. But I also have huge doubt about their sincerity in tracking the bigger weapons. Again, to repeat, as of November, they said they had only tracked 10% of the weapons they sent. I mean, a minuscule amount. Moreover, as we know, on December 7th, so last week, a congressional proposal to audit what the U.S. has already sent to Ukraine was rejected. So the U.S. won't even subject itself to an audit of itself for the billions of dollars of equipment it is sending into Ukraine. I mean, the only thing one could conclude is that they have no intention of truly tracking any of this. And again, we've seen this before. We saw it in Libya, where weapons and the jihadists we supported there ended up in far-flung places like Syria, but also in the Sahel region there, destabilizing Mali and Chad and Tunisia. Do you remember the Fast and Furious campaign in Mexico, where weapons that Obama sent there ended up in the hands of you know, drug cartels?
Cartels, yeah.
And this has happened in Colombia. This happens over and over. And so this isn't a surprise. And yet, again, when there's a proposal, a simple proposal that these things be audited, it's rejected. So I have no optimism that the U.S. intends to do anything to make sure these weapons don't end up in the wrong hands. And that's why, you know, we went to the UN Security Council and said, you, Security Council, have to do it, because the U.S. is not going to do it.
Well, is there any hope with the Republican Congress coming in January? Because the Republicans were the ones raising the alarm that there should be an audit, there should be some oversight, there should be something. And especially after CBS News got censored and they had to pull back some of their data when they did their documentary, and they were forced, because the Biden administration got, you know, in a twist, because it was getting out that it's disorganized, that they don't have an idea where these weapons are going. And so do you think the Republicans pushing that is going to have any effect, or or is it just sort of virtue signaling, if you will?
We'll see. I mean, I would like, let's put it this way. I'd like to see it happen. I think Americans should push for that. It's our money. It's billions of dollars that are not going to the homeless here, to people who are hungry, to infrastructure, right? So we should care where it's going and whether it's going to the so-called right hands. But again, as we pointed out to Security Council, even when it gets to the right hands in Ukraine, that does mean going to parties that are shelling the Donbass as we speak, right? When I was in Donetsk, a school had been shelled, a place where people went to get fresh water was shelled, and they need to go there to get fresh water because they've been cut off from their water
and this
supply.
was done by the Ukrainian,
right, and we knew because I was in the presence of a international humanitarian law lawyer from Ukraine, was with us. And at the school, he picked up some of the ordnance and said, this is American made. So we know that even when it gets into the right hands, our hard-earned tax dollars are going to hit schools and other civilian infrastructure in places like Donetsk. By the way, there was also, this relates to the other subject we were talking about, the thing we did when we went to Donetsk, we actually brought, we were partially a humanitarian aid mission to bring clothing to monks at a monastery that's being shelled almost daily by Ukraine. So not only are they outlawing the Orthodox Church and invading churches, they're actually shelling this one particular monastery to the point where the monks now live underground. And these are men and women, and another of those monks have been killed. So again, that's your tax dollars at work, and people need to realize that.
Well, Dan, I watched your presentation at the UN. It was really well done, and it obviously got a reaction from some of the Western. Could you? We're gonna wrap up here pretty soon. I wanted to end with Dmitry saying a few words, but I wanted to ask you, what was your experience like and your reception from some of the Western countries when you spoke, right after you spoke and whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, my overall feeling was a certain disappointment in the lack of seriousness with which a number of Western countries approached the subject. They were defensive and simply ignored the claims, called them conspiracies, even though, again, we were talking about things in the Washington Post and CNN and CBS. Even I quoted the Voice of America. I mean, how much more, red, white, and blue and American pie can you get than Voice of America saying that these things are going to end up in the hands of terrorists? And instead, they read their usual anti-Russian talking points. The other thing I just was really disheartened by is how the lack of diplomatic decorum by some of these people. The representative from Ukraine was just awful and suggested I was a pothead. By the way, he was absolutely bizarre. Okay. On the other hand, to I guess look at the bright side of things, I thought the two African countries, Ghana, Gabon, were open to it. Mexico was very open to it. Brazil, even under Bolsonaro, Brazil was very open to it. So you had a few countries, but yeah, I mean, my own country, the United States, was completely hostile towards me and towards the message. And let me just say something about that. And this needs to be said, first of all, because I don't think Americans understand that. You have a situation now where the U.S. has totally eschewed diplomacy. We have a State Department that is more pro-war than our Defense Department. Okay, and that's just a fact. And you have people at the UN, like the representative that I witnessed. These are not career diplomats. In Russia, people are actually trained for these jobs, right? In a very good school that I think was started under the Soviet Union. They're actually trained in diplomacy. We have political appointments. Mm-hmm. We have hacks that are sent there to merely kind of push the party line. And that's what I witnessed there. And that was very disheartening. But as I said, some of those other countries I mentioned were open to it. Of course, China was as well. China and Russia, to be honest, were the two countries that I found the most, again, to have the most diplomatic, demeanor in general, but you certainly had the feeling that the Security Council is a dysfunctional body, even though they're the ones supposed to maintain international peace and security. And I came away feeling like this is not the body that can do that. So.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, to the audience that's listening, we're going to end with, we're going to take it out with Dan's presentation. But before we do that, Dmitry, American citizens don't get a chance to hear from you very often. And because a lot of times when you're giving a press conference, you just get attacked sort of by the corporate media, just kind of throwing flames at you that you have to sort of bandy about, but you don't get to really speak. So could you express to American citizens some things that just are not getting across and that you'd like to put out there so that everyone could hear about this military operation?
Well, I think that would require much more time to get all the messages that are not going through. But I think that for the American public, you just need to view this situation from the eyes of my countrymen, of what has really happened in our immediate neighborhood. And you should understand that the way that this whole story started, you should look into the grassroots of this problem. Because for a lot of politicians right now, Western politicians, the history before 24th February doesn't exist. So everything started with Russian invasion, as they say. But there are many more aspects to this, and Dan knows quite well how people in Donbass felt about all this situation and what did they endure during these 8 years of incessant shellings from Ukraine. And when I was again on one kind of presentation, one presentation where there was a Ukrainian guy working for Carnegie or something like this, or Democracy Fund, whatever. And I was speaking about this. He tried to interrupt me, saying that nothing happened in Donbass. This is really Russian invention. And he said, I quote him, that only a handful of people were killed during this whole situation. So that's the narrative that Ukraine and its Western sponsors are trying to sell. And something very strange happened to our neighbor, to our beloved neighbor, to the country with which we always had very good relations. We were part of the same country. And all of a sudden, it has become hijacked by the people who really are kind of crazy and who represent threat to my country, who represent threat to their own country, by the way. Because again, you know that at least 60% of Ukraine is Russian speaking, and to ban Russian language there, to introduce the laws that would punish you for speaking Russian, for making education for your children in Russian, to try to ban Orthodox Church. This is something that you can't imagine in a country like this. And this, of course, leads to very tragic situations that we're facing right now. So we need to stop this fire. We had to stop the war that started 8 years ago after the Maidan coup, and we had absolutely no way to do it but to start our military operation. Again, we are ready to end it at any moment when there is a guarantee that the targets, that the goals of our military operation, which are quite clear, are obtained. And it's up to the West to decide whether they really want to support Ukraine further, to support Ukrainian regime, Kiev regime and Zelensky regime, or whether they want to look into a solution to this crisis, which is bigger than Ukraine. It's a crisis of European security. It's a crisis of trust. It's a crisis that might affect the whole system of international relations in the world, and the world will be different after this crisis. That's quite clear. We need to be looking for solutions. We need to be looking for diplomatic solutions. But instead of this, as you heard today, what we see is the deliveries of arms and all kind of military help to the Ukrainian regime. It's not that I'm sitting here and pleading to stop this kind of thing, saying that Russia will not cope with this. We will cope. It will cost us more. It will cost us more effort, unfortunately, more lives. But we will solve this issue. We will not tolerate the situation when there is this hornet's nest at our borders. And of course, it will affect the way we see Western countries, and it will affect the way we build our relations with the West, because there is very, very little trust, if any, right now. And of course, the actions like this, the delivery of weapons and all kind of support for actions that will not be tolerated in any diplomatic, democratic society. These kind of things are, of course, killing any what is rest of hope between Russia and the West. So my appeal to American citizens, to those who are really watching this show and who want to understand what's happening, is really open your heart and open your eyes and see what's happening on the ground, and don't listen to any kind of propaganda, to Ukrainian propaganda, to Western propaganda, and try to see it through our eyes, through eyes of Russian citizens who want to live in peace with their neighbors, but who don't want to be an easy state which doesn't tolerate Russian language, Russian culture, and who promotes heroization of fascism. We don't want such a state to be on our borders. I think that it's as simple as this.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Dmitry Polyanskiy. And thank you, Professor Kovalik, for being here tonight. Very profound words. We'll leave it there. Audience, please follow, when he mentioned getting other, information about this conflict, you can follow Wyatt Reade, Ava Bartlett, Max Blumenthal at the Gray Zone, the antiwar.com. You can follow Natalie Baldwin. There are several, and then there are several on the ground, as I mentioned, Ava and Wyatt, who are on the ground in Donbass and are reporting. So follow their sites, follow them on Twitter so you can get more information, and on Telegram. We'll be back next Monday at 7 p.m. and Pacific time. And I thank all of you who tuned in. We're going to end with Reif is going to play Dan's presentation for the UN so that you can watch it. It's about 17 minutes. Please enjoy and watch this as we say goodnight. Take care. And thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
School of Law. I've taught there now for 10 years. I graduated from Columbia Law School in the great city of New York in 1993. And I've been very involved in human rights issues, human rights cases, particularly in Latin America, particularly in Colombia, South America, which has a major problem with arms going into the wrong hands, into the hands of guerrilla groups, as well as right-wing paramilitary groups. And so this has been something I've been following for years. And so I want to share what I've also been studying and learning also about Ukraine and arms shipments there and the danger of those ending up in the wrong hands. So with your forbearance, I'll get right down to it. First of all, I would call your attention to a study done by the German Federal Foreign Office, the publication of the Small Arms Survey in January 2021 called Making the Rounds, Illicit Ammunition in Ukraine. Again, this is from January 2021. This is even before, the major conflict began earlier this year. And what they say is that the outbreak of the conflict in eastern Ukraine in 2014, which we have to remember, that's when it really began, led to the widespread proliferation of small arms, light weapons, and their ammunition. This ammunition, which includes thousands of grenades, rockets, mortar rounds, and landmines, along with vast quantities of firearms cartridges, has spread to nearly every oblast region of Ukraine, including areas located far from the conflict zone. And they said that while the Ukrainian government has taken steps to reduce trafficking of these arms, they said these are daunting tasks given the sheer volume of illicit ammunition in circulation and the numerous modes of transport and smuggling techniques used by traffickers in Ukraine. Now, while they conclude that at that time, there was not major transfers of those arms outside of Ukraine, they warn, again, this is 2021, that said, the barriers to smuggling grenades, rockets, and other ammunition out of Ukraine are hardly insurmountable. Even a successful trafficking scheme could radically alter the profile of illicit weapons in some countries. Preventing such schemes and reducing civilian casualties caused by loose ammunition in Ukraine will require a coordinated, sustained effort by Ukrainian authorities and the international community for many years to come. This is 2021. Now let's fast forward a bit. So this is a warning, really, given what comes next. And that is the intervention which began in February of 2022. So as my colleague said, a lot of the information on this can be found in open sources. So here's an article from April of 2022. This is merely 2 months after the war began with the Russian intervention in February. This is a CNN article. What happens to weapons sent to Ukraine? The U.S. really doesn't know. That's the title of the article. And it goes on to explain, the U.S. has few ways to track the substantial supply of anti-tank, anti-aircraft, and other weaponry it is sent across the border into Ukraine. Sources tell CNN, a blind spot that's due in large part to the lack of U.S. boots on the ground in the country and the easy portability of many of the smaller systems now pouring across the border. It is a conscious risk the Biden administration is willing to take. And they quote a senior defense official who said, this is certainly the largest recent supply to a partner country in a conflict. And at this time, there was probably $30 billion or so military had been sent. By the end of January, that's going to probably be about $100 billion all told from the U.S. alone, right? And he says, but the risk both current U.S. officials and defense analysts say is that in the long term, some of those weapons may wind up in the hands of other militaries and militias the U.S. does not intend to arm. So quoting this official, he says, we have fidelity for a short time, but when it enters the fog of war, we have almost zero. It drops into a black hole and you have almost no sense of it at all after a short period of time. In making the decision to send billions of dollars of weapons and equipment into Ukraine, the Biden administration factored in the risk that some of the shipments may ultimately end up in unexpected places, a defense official said. They also quote other officials saying, look, the U.S. really does not have a hold over where these weapons are going. They're depending on Ukraine for information regarding that. And privately, this is according to CNN, officials recognize that Ukraine has an incentive to give only information that will bolster their case for more aid, more arms, and more diplomatic assistance. So in the end, again, in April, they're warning that these arms are going to end up in places we don't want. And of course, they give the example of Afghanistan, where, of course, the U.S. left in a hurry and left how millions, if not billions of dollars of equipment there, and God knows where that is going to end up. By the way, I want to mention, before I go on much further, that I just spent a week in Donetsk, and I did not myself witness illicit transfers of arms, but, I did see the effects of arms that apparently went into the right hands, and these were ordinances, shelling, done by Ukraine against a school, against a stadium, against a place people go to get water, because, of course, water is at a premium in Ukraine. I'm sorry, in Donetsk in particular, because the water filtration system had been destroyed by Ukrainian forces sometime before. And I've been reading that shelling's only increased since I was there. Oh, by the way, a monastery that we helped deliver clothes to, that's being shelled almost daily by Ukraine. So while I'm focusing on illicit arms or arms going to the wrong people, even when it's going to the right people, it's not necessarily ending up in the right places. It's attacking civilians, and that's been happening since 2014, I want to underscore. And that's obviously a problem. And then in June of 2022, you have this article in The Guardian of London. Arms sent to Ukraine will end up in criminal hands, says Interpol chief. Jürgen Stock urges members to cooperate on arms tracing as weapons will flood hidden economy when war ends. So he's saying this with a matter of certainty. Jürgen Stock says once the conflict ends, a wave of guns and heavy arms will flood the international market. He urged Interpol's member states, especially those supplying weapons, to cooperate on arms tracing. Once the guns fall silent in Ukraine, he said, the illegal weapons will come. We know this from many other theaters of conflict. The criminals are even now, as we speak, focusing on them. Criminal groups, again, this is still quoting the head of Interpol. Criminal groups try to exploit these chaotic situations and the availability of weapons, even those used by the military, and including heavy weapons. These will be available on the criminal market, will create a challenge. No country or region can deal with it in isolation because these groups operate at a global level. Quote, again, the same Interpol chief, we can expect an influx of weapons in Europe and beyond. We should be alarmed, and we have to expect these weapons to be trafficked not only to neighboring countries, but to other continents. August 2022, CBS News did a documentary, and they have an article about the documentary. Again, why military aid in Ukraine may not always get to the front lines. And they have detail how they estimated back in April, Jonas Oman, who's the founder and CEO of Blue Yellow, a Lithuanian-based organization that has been meeting with and supplying frontline units and non-lethal military aid in Ukraine since the start of the conflict in 2014, said that back in April, he estimated that, quote, 30 to 40% of the supplies coming across the border reached its destination. So you're talking about potentially billions of dollars of equipment not reaching the intended destination. The same article from CBS goes on to say a combination of Ukraine's constantly shifting front lines with its largely volunteer and paramilitary forces has made delivery of the military aid difficult for those attempting to navigate the dangerous supply lines to their destination. Some have raised concerns about weapons falling into Ukraine's black market, which has thrived on corruption since the collapse of the Soviet Union, right, in 1991. So this isn't anything new. This isn't anything we should be surprised about. This is something that we should have been prepared for. But as I go on, you'll see that we have been woefully unprepared, almost willfully unprepared for this. So November 1, 2022, the Washington Post, U.S. races to track American arms in heat of Ukraine war. And what they say is that U.S. monitors have inspected just 10% of high-risk weapons sent to Ukraine. This is incredible. This is November. Again, for months, for years, they're saying, get a hold of this stuff. In November, a little over a month ago, they're saying, well, we probably looked at about 10% of them. Though they said the Biden administration hoped to achieve a reasonable level of compliance with U.S. oversight rules, but admitted it certainly would not achieve 100%. I mean, this, again, should be troubling to anyone. Rachel Stoll, the vice president for research programs at the Washington-based Stimson Center, this is the same article, Washington Post, said officials also must develop long-term plans to ensure the security of surplus U.S. weapons once the conflict with Russia ends, noting, again, Ukraine's history as a theater for small arms smuggling after the Cold War. Again, this has been going on for decades. The challenges in Ukraine echo the larger concerns about how weapons produced in the US, the largest global weapons seller, are employed worldwide. Advocates have long complained that despite systems designed to prevent their misuse, foreign partners have sometimes employed those arms against civilians in places including Yemen. Well, we know that, right? I mean, in Yemen, since 2015, the Saudis have used U.S. munitions, including cluster bombs, to attack civilians and civilian infrastructure, and UNESCO historic sites as well. Sophisticated equipment has also fallen into adversaries' hands, allowing the Islamic State to showcase Abrams tanks and the Taliban to pilot Black Hawk helicopters. Again, none of this surprising, but what's being done? Very little about it. Then you have the Voice of America. Okay, this is, the U.S. itself, more or less speaking, quoting the Nigerian president, November 30th, 2022, Ukraine war funneling arms fighters into Lake Chad Basin. So the Nigerian president is complaining this is already happening. He says the war between Russia and Ukraine is allowing arms and fighters to stream into the Lake Chad region, bolstering the strength of terrorist groups. Of course, we saw in the same region, in Chad and the Sahel region of Africa, after the NATO's bombing campaign and war on Libya, illicit arms flooded the Sahel region and fighters as well to stabilize places like Tunisia, Chad, Mali, and even Syria, right? You should read Seymour Hersh's piece about that, Pulitzer Prize winning Seymour Hersh's article about that transfer of fighters to Syria from Libya. But in any case, so this is already happening, according to the Nigerian president. Weapons from Ukraine are already ending up in the hands of extremists. Finally, in terms of what I'm relying on, you can look at an interesting opinion piece in the Hill publication from thehill.com. This is December 7th. This is 2 days ago, 2022. Preventing U.S. weapons from escaping Ukraine is a challenge. Again, underscoring the difficulty, if not impossibility, of getting a handle on all these weapons, which goes back to the first report saying we need international oversight over this. And with respect, and I'm an American, so I can say this, the U.S. isn't going to do it. In fact, 2 days ago, the same day this was written, a House committee that was considering whether to do an audit on weapons transfers to Ukraine and money sent to Ukraine, that resolution was voted down. Congress affirmatively decided we're not going to audit the billions and billions of dollars of weaponry we're sending to Ukraine. As an American taxpayer, I can say I don't like that, but I would think as the Security Council in charge of maintaining international peace and security, you shouldn't like that. Who is watching the watchman here? It is the job of the Security Council to do that. I urge you to do that, but I'll also
Mr.
echo
Kovalik,
could I just
interrupt you
that
for
the
a
only
minute?
way to
I think we
deal
are
with this-
running short of time. May I request you to to round off as soon as you can? Thank you.
Yes, I'm gonna wind up right now. I just want to reiterate the comments of my colleague who opened this session, saying that what really has to happen is the end of this war, a negotiated end of this war, which I think is possible. We know back in March or April, there was apparently a deal that both sides could have lived with, that apparently Boris Johnson from the UK went and told Zelensky not to sign. But apparently there is a deal, some way to end this conflict. This needs to be ended, and it needs to be ended through negotiated settlement. And again, I urge the Security Council to work towards that end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.